Institute, and thank you so much for joining us for today's event, looking at the draft NGO law in Egypt and its impact on civil society there. Needless to say, it has been a very emotional week for civil society activists in Egypt and here in Washington, and our heart goes out to all the defendants in the case, to Nancy Okail from Freedom House, to others here in the audience, to Charles Dunn of Freedom House, who's also an MEI scholar, to Natasha Tynes of the International Center for Journalists, whose crime was teaching journalists how to tweet. Our heart goes out to all of them, and we hope that this case will be resolved with time. I should note, I think I read somewhere that the judge in this case had recently passed down a sentence on a police sharpshooter who had been responsible for killing protesters in Tahrir Square, who got a lesser sentence than some of the defendants in this case. So this was clearly a very politically motivated trial, persecuted by Mubarak-era judges, brought by then Minister of International Cooperation, Faiza Abul-Naga, under then military rule. And since then, there's been a hope that the environment for NGOs would improve in the new Egypt under the new Morsi leadership. And yet it seems that the same objectives that informed the old draft law, or the old NGO law, are informing the new draft law, and that is a desire to restrict as much as possible civil society in Egypt today. And this is what we're going to examine, this law and what's at stake. Just to give you a few quotes, it was crafted by the Morsi government, put out there for discussion, and it's now in front of the Shura Council for more debate and possibly a vote. According to the Morsi government, this current draft, quote, aims to provide a suitable environment for civil societies to carry out their activities freely, transparently, and responsibly. That is how they've characterized it. But groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have characterized it as highly restrictive. Some groups like Freedom House have called it even more punitive than the old NGO law. Whatever the degree of restrictiveness, it certainly reflects poorly on the Morsi government's pledge to respect civil society in Egypt today. So we'll talk about the details. It's a somewhat confusing law. We're going to talk about the impact and the implications for the democracy movement in general in Egypt. And to do so, we've got two individuals who've been following this law very, very closely, and were very kind to join us on very short notice and to come out in this rain. And thank you all for coming out in this terrible rain. Sarah Margon and Nancy Okail. Sarah, who'll be speaking first, is the Deputy Washington Director at Human Rights Watch. Prior to joining HRW, she was the Associate Director of Sustainable Security and Peacebuilding at CAP, where she worked on human rights, foreign aid, and good governance. Prior to that, Margon served as Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin and as Staff Director to the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on African Affairs. She'll be followed by Nancy Okail, who's the Director of Freedom House Egypt program and is currently a visiting scholar at SAIS. She has over 12 years of experience in promoting democracy and development in the MENA region. In one of her previous positions, Dr. Okail worked with the Egyptian government as a Senior Evaluation Officer of Foreign Aid and has managed programs for Egyptian pro-democracy organizations that challenged the Mubarak regime. They will speak, then we'll have a Q&A, and I think there are a few other people in the audience who I'd like to have say a few words today. But on a final note, I hope you saw our article on NGOs from Sarah Carr. If you didn't pick it up downstairs, please check it out online. She wrote for us as part of our new Arab Transitions program. We are focusing on Egypt for the next several months, so go to our website and you'll see lots of great articles on everything from the current blasphemy law, which Sand Monkey, the Egyptian blogger, has been writing about, to an interview with the Minister of Planning, Amr El-Darag of the FJP. So lots of good material on Egypt for your future research. Check it out and tell us what you think. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Sarah to the podium.
Hi. I'm really pleased to be here. I feel like I should apologize in advance to the front row. I sort of feel like I'm sitting in your lap. So if you need me to back up a little bit, just let me know. Kate, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and to MEI more generally for hosting. I think it's a particularly timely event, unfortunately. We've been talking a lot about the NGO bill, watching the drafts go through with our Egypt team, and I think we continue to be rather shocked at just how antithetical the bill is to the ideals of the revolution. And as we watch it move forward with little hope of it turning or reversing in a better direction at this point, I think the question becomes, which I'll discuss at the end, sort of the way forward and where we go. I also want to thank Nancy for being here. I know it's been a really tough week, and as much as talking personally about these issues is going to be difficult, I think we benefit in the policy community from hearing your personal experience and your analysis from that. So thank you for coming, and I suspect it will be a very interesting conversation. I look forward to it. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the bill, which, as has been said, is rather complicated, and there are some differing interpretations, although there is one thing I think many of us can agree on, which is that it's quite restrictive and discretionary. Then I'll talk about some of the specific, sort of what's new in this draft, or different in this draft versus the other drafts. I'll talk about some of the particular articles that we find problematic, and recommendations for going forward. And I'm hoping in the Q&A period we can have a larger discussion about recommendations for going forward, because as is the case in many countries that we work in on NGO bills, it's always a difficult place for the U.S. To help move things in a better direction. I've seen many a bill pass in many countries that have simply gutted civil society. So before I get into the various articles that we find problematic, I just want to talk about the generalities of this bill, which, as I understand it, it moved yesterday from the Shura Council to the General Assembly. So there's a day of rest right now, which I guess is good. It allows us all to step back and take a look at where things are going and sort of analyze. But it seems very clear that it's part of a very worrisome trend that is hostile to NGOs, a suppression of civil society, and that is, as I said before, not the direction that we had expected to see the post-Mubarak era to go in. So this law is both restrictive and discretionary. It is replete with bureaucratic and administrative hurdles. So even if you were to get all your funding, you'd still have such intense, let's put it generously and say oversight, but I often say interference, from, excuse me, the Egyptian government, that you might not be able to do your work. Many of the provisions are arbitrary. A lot of the definitions are poorly defined. There are contradictory provisions. And it seems in many ways that the driving force behind the NGO conviction of this week is the same trend that has moved this draft law forward, which is a suspicion of international organizations, a suspicion of NGOs in general, a suspicion that they are not here to help to create a robust democracy, to enable good governance and rule of law, but instead to thwart the powers that be and make life difficult. So in its current format, if this draft law were to pass, it would not be compatible with international human rights standards, with fundamental respect for rights in any way. It would curb the right of freedom of association through legal restrictions that, from our assessment, are even more draconian than Law 84 of 2002, which is part of the issue here. You see both restrictive and discretionary. As I said, the definitions are really broad, and because they're arbitrary, they become very confusing. There's, in debating some of the foreign funding provisions, we saw one article say one thing and one article say another. And I think what's so remarkable is that it falls so far short of Egypt's human rights obligations, not only its international obligations, but its own constitution, and some of the discussions that have been going on since February 2011. And I think it is quite remarkable. And the international community responded to the NGO verdict this week. The UN Secretary General, I probably saw State Department and White House statements here in DC, the EU. Some of these statements put the NGO verdict in the larger context of the NGO bill, and some didn't. But I think it's important to put it in that context because it is the trend that we're going towards. So ultimately, I think what this bill would do, if it were passed, would reinforce and formalize state control over the NGOs. And I'll talk a little bit later about the role of the security sector in this, which has been on and off again a very large problem. But what's remarkable, I actually expected you to use this quote, Kate, but you talked about sort of what the Egyptian presidency is trying to do. And the quote that we have been focused on is that the presidency said, "This new draft aims to maintain a balance between openness and sovereignty and independence." But in reality, it actually gives the government excessive powers over NGOs. And even, as I said earlier, if foreign funding is allocated, it would then be able to stop fundraising, stop funding from going, and stop operations at its own whim. So the general themes that concern us are the arbitrary limitations on fundraising and foreign funding to Egyptian NGOs, the fact that it enables the government to interfere on internal governance, both on a project / operation basis and then annually in regular accountability requirements, and it places severe restrictions on NGOs, on international NGOs. So what does the new draft do? What's different from the new draft that recently went through the Shura Council versus the old draft? We see two changes. They are a small step forward, but I don't think that we should get so focused on the fact that it's a small step forward because the rest of the bill remains so poor. The two main changes are that it no longer designates NGO money as public funds, which previous drafts did, which meant that NGOs would be even further open to scrutiny and interference and would have to be publicly accountable to the central auditing agency. So that is no longer part of the bill, and it does not now set forward an explicit role for the state security apparatus in overseeing the work of NGOs. So that language has been taken out of the bill. So those are very small but good steps forward. But what does it do instead? It still leaves open the possibility for the Prime Minister to appoint members of the security apparatus to the coordinating committee, which more than one of us have called the Central Committee at times. This is the coordinating committee that would oversee the funding and the operations of the NGOs. This is the committee that will make decisions about the registration as well. The security agencies have been explicitly taken out of the drafting language, but the way the language is written, it is very likely that they will be part of the committee. It now allows the Prime Minister to appoint 4 individuals. So effectively, they can still halt or limit at their discretion. This is a violation of the freedom of expression and association under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The bill still requires NGOs to receive approval from this coordinating committee before it receives any foreign funding. And as you probably well know, there are limited amounts of funding for NGOs within Egypt. If there's an Egyptian businessman or businesswoman outside the country who wants to fund an NGO, this would have to go through the central committee, or the coordinating committee. And it requires civil society organizations to submit an annual report that lists the decision of the organization's General Assembly, and it gives the committee the right to reject those decisions. So this is part of the internal interference in organizational governance that I was referring to earlier. It seems to me that government should not have a place in regulating the internal actions of an organization. There's no problem with trying to know how many NGOs there are in your country. There's no problem trying to understand who they are, to ask them to register. But it should stop long before we get to the point of discussing providing accountability and annual reports to a government and then having them stop the actions of that NGO. So some of the articles that are most concerning to us, I'm going to just pull a few of them because there's a lot of them that are concerning, and we could probably be here for a few hours debating why and how. But I wanted to flag, I guess, about 5 or 6. Article 13, this is the article that makes foreign funds conditional upon a notification process to the coordinating committee without objection. It is this committee that I mentioned earlier that would be created by the Prime Minister. Obviously, this is a huge problem in our view. Article 14 arbitrarily limits fundraising by allowing the government to object within 15 days. There's no criteria, no delineation of what the government would object on. So if you suddenly decide your organization needs to fundraise, you may not, to work on a certain project, you may not be able to do that anymore. And there's total discretion for the government to be able to stop that process. Article 18 obligates groups to submit annually to the government copies of its accounts, the decisions of its board, its activities report. Really, it's a micromanaging of the internal happenings of an organization. And having worked for a number of NGOs, I know it's a big deal to go through those processes of putting all that administrative work together. To have to do it annually to the government is quite a bureaucratic challenge. Article 57, international organizations have to apply for registration to the coordinating committee. And again, here, it's not clear who's going to sit on this committee. The specific phrase that is now in the draft law is concerned entities, which is, in our understanding, a reference to the security apparatus. So there will be 8 individuals sitting on there. Unclear to me how many of them will be from the security apparatus. And what a security apparatus in a country is doing regulating the business of NGOs, also not okay, to put it simply. Article 63, another foreign funding provision that sets no limits on the discretion of the coordinating committee to restrict funds. Article 63 and Article 13 are a little bit contradictory. We've been looking at them together. They are confusing and they add a certain level of complexity to how foreign funding will be managed. Article 70, strong financial penalties that basically align for organizations that don't follow the registration process, don't follow the accounting process, don't go through the coordinating committee for foreign funds. The penalties, based on what we can understand from Article 70, are more severe than they were in the Mubarak regime, under the Mubarak regime and the penal code, which is what led to the NGO verdict, if I'm not mistaken. Article 72 makes it virtually impossible for organizations to work outside of this challenging and restrictive environment. So basically what Article 72, along with a few of the other penalizing ones, do is remove a gray zone where organizations could work, where organizations could continue to do what they intended to do, even if the government knew they were there, but were sort of quietly and discretionarily okay with the work. This is no longer feasible, it would seem, from the language in this bill. Other articles that set limitations on activities have very vague language that could subject NGOs to arbitrariness. Article 59, NGOs cannot undertake activities that are conducted by political parties or that violate national sovereignty. It's not really clear what that means. How I define it might be differently than how the government of Egypt defines it. Therefore, the operation could be suspended. The registration would not be allocated. Articles 60 and 61 bans groups from using their funds for anything other than their authorized objectives. Again, does this mean that you submit a list of what you intend to do and your objectives to the coordinating committee? And if you deviate from that, even if it's tangentially related or important in the broader sphere, do you lose your registration and is your funding cut off? Are your assets seized? That's not clear. So as you can see, there's a number of interlocking articles that many of which are less clear than the next, which make for a very difficult environment. Some of it is restrictive, some of it is bureaucratic, and others are open to the discretion of the coordinating committee, as well as how each NGO defines what they're doing because of those very broad definitions. So I think maybe I'll conclude a little bit with the way forward so we can get to Nancy and then go to Q&A. As I said, the bill's moved from the Shura Council to the General Assembly. We expect that this bill will be adopted in a matter of weeks, but we've also been expecting that for a while. So we don't have a clear read right now on sort of where things are going to move or how quickly they're going to move. Statements are really good. I was very pleased with the White House statement. We were pleased, although would have liked to see a stronger statement from the State Department, number of Congress members. But statements only go so far. That said, we have seen the Morsi presidency is worried about how they're being perceived internationally. Members of the presidency circulated their analysis of the NGO bill to a number of think tanks in town this week. They shared sort of their clarifications on misconceptions, I think it was called. So they are aware that the international community is paying attention and they are worried about what that looks like. Right now, our main push is for the bill to be scrapped or, if passed, totally amended. That's best case scenario. Just gut the bill. Let's do one that makes sense, that is aligned with international human rights standards, that affords NGOs freedom of expression and association. But that doesn't look to be the case in the near term. And so short of that, we need to continue sounding the alarm internationally at the UN. I think those statements are going to continue to be important. But I would also say that the NGO bill, the verdict, the issues that surround this type of restrictive environment need to be brought up across the board. We often see, at least with the U.S. government, that's really the only government I will speak for at this point, has put human rights issues on the side and focused on economic reform, focused on other very pressing reforms. Egypt is a really important partner for the United States. Nobody doubts that. Nobody's in question of that. But I think putting the human rights, the freedom of expression, and the freedom of association concerns into the center of the conversation is a critical articulation of really how we see the whole package. It's not just about IMF reforms. It's not just about your economy and us helping you get your economy better, or you being an important partner when we deal with the Middle East peace plan. It's also about how you manage your own accountability and your transparency at home, because we see that as a full package. And all of those issues are important to us. We're not going to take them piecemeal and help you build up your economy and then get to the human rights issues later. Civil society is a genuine part of real reform, and if we don't have that, you haven't reformed in the way that you intended upon revolution. If we look at the direction other countries have gone, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Burundi, Russia, if you look at civil society in these countries where the NGO bills have passed, in some cases, civil society has been totally gutted. They have had their assets frozen, they have left the country, they're living in exile. In other countries like Russia, we're starting to see the implications of an NGO bill. We're starting to see a crackdown, we're starting to see search, surveillance, seizure. There's a chilling effect among NGOs. This is what we want to avoid in Egypt. Egypt is too important a country, a partner, and has too much of a robust civil society as is. So to avoid that crackdown, some of the measures I discussed above are really important. And then just quickly we get to the creative thinking. Congress is very quick to use its blunt instruments of legislation to condition aid and cut it off. That doesn't necessarily make sense. But what about shifting some of the security funding? And I recognize that the Camp David Accords mean that we can't do one without the other. But what about shifting some of the security funding to be an incentive for engagement, to be an incentive for the NGO bill to be scrapped and or amended? What about looking at ways to engage civil society outside the country so that they continue to push on the inside? Egypt has, at one time Egypt had 3 different lobby shops representing them here in Washington. I'm not, frankly, sure how many they have right now. But that also is an interesting and creative way to think about how to engage with Egypt. Egypt spends a lot of money getting those lobby shops to represent them. And perhaps they would be better served focusing that effort at home and working with their civil society and working with their own reform process. So I'll just leave it there. I'm very open to additional suggestions and further discussion on this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I think I'll have you swap seats.
Okay. Just grab my water.
Thank you so much for having me today. And every time I'm speaking publicly, I think the day before, what am I going to speak about? But today, I was thinking if I'm going to be able to speak in the first place, because it's been a very hard and emotional week, and it's I'm not in this all by myself. I mean, I'm looking at the room and I'm overwhelmed by my colleagues, Mohammed and Basim and Rauda, and the last time we were together, we were in a cage, and our group Facebook pictures look slightly different than the ones you see for a group of friends getting together because they are behind bars. But anyways, let's get over this and try to focus on what this law represents. What does this bill represent for the future of civil society in Egypt? And I mean, thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, like, this is the most elaborate analysis I've heard of the law, and you've seen it's very clear, and it just identifies particularly why people are having issues with it. But what I'm going to talk about is mainly, what does this mean in practice? I mean, some people think about the law and say it's not as if we're living in a country that really rules of law that this is going to make a difference, but it does. I mean, and I'm going to talk about it. Why would it affect generally the overall environment for a civil society organization? And two particular aspects. Why is it going to affect organizations that are working on developmental projects and economic projects? And why is it going to affect organizations that are working on human rights and democracy? And this is when it gets to the nitty-gritty details on how these laws are translated into practice and what do people do in order to implement those. So, for example, when we start talking, let me talk about the developmental projects to begin with. When this whole campaign against civil society started, shortly after the revolution by Minister Faiza Abunaga and the Minister of Justice, the claim and what they said publicly in order to appeal to the public sentiment is that these foreign fundings are directed to democracy and human rights and other issues. Well, people are poor. They need bread on their tables. It's like playing on those sentiments. It's like they're very elitist. They play in those issues and they're not paying attention to the real needs of people. We need bread, we need developmental projects, we need health and education. Okay, fine. Let's talk about that. Do you know what does it take in very simple layman language to implement a developmental project in education or in health? How do we do it? Let's start from the beginning, or the progressive work of the OECD, of the Paris Declaration, which identified 5 dimensions of what makes a good and effective project and effective use of foreign aid. One of the 5 dimensions, the first one is country ownership. What does it mean, country ownership, when it translates as an indicator? Is that the people themselves of the country identify and determine their needs, and identify and determine their priorities. What does this mean? It means that people, in order to start to work on any project, they have to conduct a survey. They have to conduct a needs assessment survey. That is what? That is research. That is banned under the articles of these organizations. So, I mean, if this law is passed and they ban this, and the international organization come with their top-down approach telling us what we need, and then after that we blame them for imposing their projects on us, I mean, we started it. We are the ones who banned the people from researching their own environment, looking at their access to, I mean, like, what is needed, what is missing, what is appropriate in this culture. This is not something that can be done by an international expert. It has to be done by local organization, because they are the ones who knows the needs by themselves. So in order to conduct a needs assessment survey, the small focus group work that they do at the beginning of any project in order to see that, and at the end also they have to conduct the same research to evaluate the effectiveness of this project. This is not going to happen. The second thing under this law, the second thing is, like, we cannot look at this law in isolation from what's happening in the country in terms of the legislation environment. So as we are talking about the NGO law, we are also talking about the law for access of information, or freedom of information. You cannot really start in conducting and building developmental organization and work on planning the priority of a country without having an access of information to the local budget. You understand, it's like the overall governmental budget, but also the down to the municipalities level, and understanding what kind of budget and how they are dispersed, and what on what basis, and who makes those decisions. I mean, like, one of the most successful experiences on budgeting was in Brazil, when they, in the health sector, is that when they conducted their participatory budget approaches in the way of reforming the health sector, because people had access to understanding what the budget is about, and this is how they started doing this. With this law again, and with all the articles that Sarah said or mentioned, this is not going to be able to be accepted. It would be criminalized. So you go and you try to do what Minister Faiza Abu Naga has professed, that this is our priority, let's go bake bread. But in order to bake bread, we have to understand what kind of material we have. And we have to make a survey, and we have to make a research. So this is, I mean, like the practicality of it. Let's talk about how does this affect human rights and development organization. I mean, the foreign funds that are now available or channeled to Egypt are financing and supporting people who are supporting the transition, work on rule of law and the work on human rights protection, but also the daily issues. The number of human rights lawyers who work in all the organizations that we know that run around between police stations every day trying to get people who get arbitrary arrests every day, they will be laid off. They will not be having their salaries, which means that this law simply does not put an end to a civil society organization only, but also puts an end to the revolution, because those people, I mean, will not have someone to stand for them. So these are all the practical implications of this law. And I just want to tell you, I mean, again, as this law cannot be seen in isolation from the demonstration law or from the freedom of information law and the overall environment, we can also see it in separation from what happened in the NGO law and the NGO case. And I'm not talking about it because of, I mean, like, it affected us personally, but because the timing and the justification that the judge gave for this case, or his verdict, is very dangerous. And let me read for you part of what he said. The revolution regained freedom, human dignity, social justice that were absent from Egypt for a long time. Regained already, so we're fine. We don't need any more of that sort of work. It overthrew those who held power, and it paved the way towards building a modern civil democratic state. This worried the United States, and other countries supported the Zionist entity of Israel and terrified them, so that the US reaction was that it threw all the weight against this change, where its old mechanisms are no longer able to fit. This is an arrest warranty for the rest of the local organizations in Egypt. So it's not about us. It's like, if our case is over, our fate is already determined or whatever. The concern now is this law combined by this verdict coming out. It is a green light to crack down on the rest of local organizations in Egypt. And I'm going to stop here and we can just go on and talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Nancy. Thank you both. Why don't you remain at the podium? You've painted a very bleak picture for NGOs, both operating with local funding and with foreign funding, and we hope that with increased international pressure that might change. Before we go into a Q&A, just a few things I want to mention. Obviously, there are other perspectives and views of this draft NGO law, and we welcome them here today. We'd very much like to hear the official Egyptian position in case somebody from the embassy would like to make any remarks. We'll get to that. I'd also like to note another perspective that I hear from many of my very well-informed Egyptian colleagues and friends who are not happy with obviously the verdict in the NGO trial, and who are very critical of this draft NGO law, but also point out that after the fall of Mubarak, when millions of dollars was fed to Egypt from USAID to organizations involved in political organizing, that many Egyptians were very offended by that and saw that as an infringement upon Egyptian political sovereignty. So this is an important position that also should be noted here, and I hope somebody might speak to that at this event or at the next event. So I just wanted to bring those two positions up. And I want to turn to some of the people in the audience whom I've asked to address some of the other concerns here. My colleague Sebastian Boll from the Sebastian Graf, excuse me, from the Heinrich Boll Foundation. The Germans have been very concerned about this draft law. I'd like him to speak briefly. Julie Hughes of NDI and our representative from the Egyptian embassy. Why don't we start with Sebastian?
Thank you very much, Kate, and I really enjoyed both Sarah's and Nancy's presentation. As you rightly pointed out, that the German government is very concerned about what happened overall in Egypt with regard to the NGO law, but in particular with regard to the verdict on Tuesday. I cannot speak on behalf of the German government here. I work for one of the German political foundations that were also targeted in Egypt. Not my organization, the Heinrich Böll Foundation. We don't have an office in Egypt. We actually, before the campaign against NGOs started in December 2011, we intended to open an office in Egypt, but we then decided to do that instead in Tunis. What happened on Tuesday was also that the court declared to dissolve the office of our friends, the office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is affiliated with the German Conservative Party that are in government right now, so it's an organization that is closely affiliated with Chancellor Merkel, and that's why the German government is very concerned about this development. Among the defendants were not only Egyptians, not only 2 Germans. There were also 3 Serbs and 1 Norwegian. So that's why also Catherine Ashton, not only the German foreign minister, spoke out and criticized the verdict, but also Catherine Ashton was very critical. I think all the actors in Germany and in Brussels are outraged. It's absurd because when President Morsi was in Berlin earlier this year, he actually assured that the activities of the German political foundations will be brought under new cultural cooperation agreement. So this is in the verdict on Tuesday is in total contradiction what the president had said. The German government, what I have been told, is examining, probably similar to the U.S. government, is examining its next steps. I totally welcome Sarah's comment that we have to look for incentives. Of course, there will be also in Berlin. I have heard already the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee talking about we have to look for more conditionalities. We have to maybe cut aid. We should look for conditionality. We should look for incentives. And I think for us as an organization that is supporting civil society organizations on the ground across the Arab world, it's important that the defendants have a possibility to appeal the verdict, and that NGOs can act freely. Therefore, I think it's great that MEI is hosting this event that tries to broaden the discussion beyond the verdict and talks about the NGO law. So.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for that. Wanted to, Julie, did you want to say something briefly?
Sure. I will actually, to the Egyptian embassy colleagues in the room, express some compassion, because I think you're probably going to have rough, long days ahead. I think one of the things, both Sarah and Nancy have clearly articulated one of the linchpins here, and it's really how we view the role of civil society. In the United States, we believe that unruly civil society organizations are absolutely critical for pluralism, for democracy. And in Egypt, I think there is a much higher threshold for state control as a general rule, and that is understandable. And really, what would be a constructive debate is about what are the minimum standards, right? Those international conventions of which Egypt is a party to, and was part of the discussion are really designed to create that minimum standard. And it is, from my perspective, the most critical debate happening probably anywhere in the world today, because Egypt is too big to fail, because Egypt is a leader in the world, and because dictators learn. And so there are other potential authoritarian leaders all over the world who are saying, well, if they can get away with it. And that understanding is very much underpins what our Egyptian colleagues probably refer to as the American obsession with these NGOs. I think it is, or at least what I hope will be, an obsession, because I agree that it is impossible to build, engage, maintain a democratic, pluralistic society without it. We are seeing, even today, in our own government, that left unfettered, they will dip into our personal lives in ways that we as citizens are not comfortable with. And so our civil society must be free, every civil society organization must be free to cry foul and to raise their hand and object. And then I have a whole host of detailed questions for all of you, but I will wait.
Thank you, Julie. I'd like to invite our representative from the Egyptian Embassy, yes, to say a few words. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, don't try.
As Julie said, it's not easy.
No. Well, thank you very much, and I share my colleagues Sarah and Nancy's interest about the entire issue of NGOs, and we as a government, we fully believe in the role of NGOs, and we believe they are actually the backbone of the development in our society. And but allow me to point out a few things. First, I wanted to avoid. I thought the discussion would be more about the law rather than the verdict. But I've noticed that it's inevitable to talk for a second about the verdict first, to clarify a couple of issues about it, and to lead us to our discussion about the NGO law.
And if you could bring...
Yes, sure. First of all, this verdict has been issued by a court of law. Second thing, it was raised by a different government under a law which we are currently trying to change. I've heard claims that it is basically a politicized case, that the government has been pushing for a specific verdict here or there, and I believe everybody a couple of weeks ago was basically lamenting about the contentious relationship between the executive and the judicial authorities in Egypt. I fail to understand how those pieces are put together. The government has, and not only the government, the different factions in the Egyptian political spectrum have agreed that the old law has to be changed. And this is a matter of consensus. However, it does not mean that a breach of the previous, of the current laws actually, have to be neglected. And at the end of the day, we believe in the separation of powers, and there will be legal recourses to through which the NGOs and the employees, their employees, can work on through them actually in order to change the verdict if the law is on their side. But I'll go quickly and talk about again the NGO law. First of all, we have to take into account that this is only a draft, which is currently being discussed, will continue being discussed for the coming weeks with different stakeholders. You mentioned minimum standards. We are currently having an intensive conversation with the United Nations in order to understand how to improve the law. There are points which we might not agree on, both of us, but at the same time, there is, I think, the only authority which can make a real judgment in this regard, based on our obligations, is the United Nations and Human Rights Council. We've heard reports. There was a statement about an earlier version of the law. The current version is totally different. We will continue. Actually, the discussion we're having today will be transferred to Egypt in order to try to improve and to convey the discussion that we're having, the different points that have been raised and will be raised. And I believe the process will go on. I don't have an exact time frame for the process. I wonder, the idea of a few weeks, where did it come from? We've heard any contradicting remarks about this from our Shura Council members, but like none of them mentioned 3-4 weeks at least. So there is still time for debate. The debate with the different stakeholders, including NGOs, and actually was the driving force to change the initial drafts. And with regard to specificities, I want to raise 3 issues. First of all, that unlike the previous case, this law, there are no committee can make a ruling, can make a decision in itself to withhold funding, to banish or dissolve an NGO, but this has to be through a court ruling. So it is not the committee, the coordination committee does not take a decision in itself and implement it by itself.
But they can reject, but then they can say no to an NGO, but then that NGO can appeal in court.
Through a court, yes.
But only if the NGO appeals.
No.
That's the version of the law that I saw on May 30th, said that it was up to the NGO to appeal that ruling by the committee. You're saying there's a June version of the law?
No, I'm saying that the specific article does not determine whether it has to go first. And the decision itself will not be implemented unless there is a court ruling. This is my interpretation of, not only mine actually, this is a widespread interpretation of that article.
And this is part of the problem. I think there's so much to be interpreted, it's not really clear, what
the second thing, to the best of my knowledge, and again, this is only a draft of the NGO law. And I believe there will be a lot of changes because basically there have been a number of dialogues and conversations, even within the Shura Council itself, making comments about specific articles here and there. But like at the end of the day, the Egyptian Parliament will have to discuss the text article by article and make its entire decision. One last thing, I believe that first of all, when it comes to the committee, we believe, for instance, that the German case has a similar committee. When it comes to reporting, we believe that at least we believe that even the American case, there is a reporting process. The general perception that many people in Egypt, regardless of the specificities of the law, we're now trying to judge a law which has not been finalized, which is still under discussion, which has even the contentious areas have been, or like the debatable areas, have been borrowed basically from other legal and like similar contexts. We personally wonder whether this is related to intentions of the committees or any doubting the intentions of the government itself or of the framework, or if there are specificities of that.
Great, thank you so much. I think our speakers would both like to respond. So, Nancy.
As the representative of the Egyptian embassy indicated, we're not going to discuss the verdict here. It is a country that's ruled by law. It's not political at all, so there's no point to speak about it here. But as for the law, I would like to thank you very much because your words brought me home. And everything you said is all way too familiar, and it brought familiarity to something I've lived for, so it's nice to feel a bit of home here. I think you remember very well, Mr. Amgad, we had the same conversation exactly in November 2012 when we were discussing the draft of the Egyptian constitution. And every time we come up with issues about the particular articles, very specific, not talking rhetorically, these are the articles that are problematic in the Egyptian constitution, and the same answer is like, this is not the final draft. Why are you so concerned? The final draft is not out yet. And it's the same with every single law. I mean, if there is a clear process, clear milestones, deadline, when you tell us, say, in July 1st, you will see the draft, so like rest assured now, when you see it, you're going to find it and comment about it, we'd be happy to do that. But this has been the process all the way with every single piece of legislation and every single law or decree that was made, and it's the same issue. It's like, you're commenting on something, basically the bottom line, you're commenting about something that's irrelevant because this is not the draft that you've seen. And then when you wake up the next day and the law is passed and the constitution is passed.
And that's why this debate is very important. Sarah, did you want to make a comment before we open the floor to questions? We're running out of time.
Just a very quick comment on that. And this is actually what draft legislation is for. It's for engaging society and it's for commenting. So to take the comments, to bring them back, to say we have concerns with these 15 articles or this one article, and then to say, oh, this makes sense, we hear your comments. Having spent some time working in the legislature here over on Capitol Hill, I'm well aware of the painful process that one goes through when looking at draft legislation. But to say that this draft is dramatically different than previous drafts, I think I seem to have a very poorly translated English version then. Because I think this is exactly what democracy is about. This is what political reform is not saying this is not the final draft, why are you so concerned? Don't worry, everything will be fine. But saying, I look forward to this conversation, I want to hear what you have to say, and then taking some of those and working not just with the UN, which you may see as the arbiter and the minimum standards holder, if you will, but saying, all right, these civil society groups actually know what they're talking about. They are on the ground every day engaging in this. And so draft legislation is, in fact, an incredibly important tool along the path of getting towards that final version.
Great. Yes.
Good.
Thank you.
Then I look forward to the next
Thank you
draft.
so much. Well, let's get on to some questions. I think. Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Let's not make this personal. All right. We would like to open the floor to questions. I think I'll package 2 or 3 at a time, since I'm sure there'll be a lot. This lady, if you could please.
Sure. Paula Schrieffer with the U.S. State Department. I'm actually the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organizations. Very encouraged by your comments that you are open to the feedback from the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN system. I know that the High Commissioner has in fact commented very extensively on the draft NGO law and expressed very, very strong concerns, many of which parallel the concerns raised by civil society as well as with the U.S. government. So I do hope, in fact, that you will take the comments from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights into account in redrafting or revising the version of the law. I also just want to note that, of course, the U.S. government and the State Department has been very, very outraged by the verdict. We've condemned the verdict. We've worked very closely with our partners in Germany and other countries, and we will actually be delivering a very strong statement again at the Human Rights Council on Monday together as a joint statement with other countries who are deeply concerned. So we do stand with you, and I appreciate your participation. Nancy is a former colleague and a friend of mine as well, so I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Some questions.
Michael Cowan from Democracy International. Beyond domestic partnerships and sort of diplomatic pressure, what legal or ethical justification do you see the United States or other foreign governments or international bodies have in sort of interfering with domestic Egyptian law?
So one question, I'm going to read this question from the overflow room. More specifically, what kind of congressional action, let's see, besides getting military and aid, is there anything that would be, oh gosh, I'm sorry, person in the back, I can't read your handwriting. So let's go to another question in the room.
My name is Patrick Friedel. I work for the Bureau of International Labor Affairs at the United States Department of Labor. We have a number of different projects that we fund that are in Egypt that are implemented by the ILO or the World Food Program to eradicate child labor, to build capacity of trade unions, social protection, social dialogue. And we're trying to get ahead of things and understand how this is going to affect our programming in the country with stuff that is implemented through the ILO, through the World Food Program, and is contracted through local NGOs. So I would just be curious to know what your thoughts are on how programming that's run through, for example, the International Labor Organization's Cairo office will be affected by this legislation. Thank you.
I can take a stab. In terms of the first question, I would, well, I'm not the U.S. government, so civil society feels that these are laws, and Human Rights Watch works very closely with a lot of local NGOs in Cairo and beyond, and so I think for us it's not interfering with Egyptian law, but it's trying to have a say and engage the government and the various government entities on a law that will have a direct impact on our ability to do the work. I don't know if you've seen the statement from 40 or 43 Egyptian NGOs that came out yesterday or the day before, but I think those NGOs also sort of take the view that this is a violation of international civil and political rights, freedom of expression, associations. That's what I was talking about, the bare minimum of international human rights standards are being violated. I would suggest that it's not an interference, but as a civil society that supports human rights, rule of law, and democracy, we believe that freedom of expression and association is a fundamental right for these groups. So to block their ability to do that, whether it's through bureaucratic challenges and hurdles or through denying them funding, is a violation of international law. Does that get you where you need to go? Okay. And then, do you want to take that one? On this one, I would say we have yet to see. Right? Is the big answer. Obviously, what the law looks like when it's passed. It's a fair point. I don't expect to see anything much better than this. I'd love to, but my expectation is not that we're going to see a total revolution in any upcoming draft based on the incremental changes that we've seen thus far. But I think the question of what funding is and is not able to be allocated and how quickly to keep your programs up and running, to keep your partners alive and well, whether they're in Cairo or beyond. I think defining the objectives there's a whole bunch of bureaucratic and administrative requirements that these NGOs are going to have to do, whether it's human rights or development projects. And based on this, if it's this law that passes or a version close to this, there's going to be a lot of work that has to get done, it would seem, before foreign funding can be allocated. You know, there's an irony to this, of course, because a significant portion of the government of Egypt's budget does come from international funding. And so I would question why NGOs are no longer allowed to receive this funding based on very prescribed regulations, but the government in Egypt continues to be able to. So, I think we have yet to see, and of course there is the question of what's implemented and what's not. So, sorry it's not clearer than that.
Did you want to say anything? Okay. Question? Then we've got a question from the overflow room. Is this draft a case of the backwards movement from democracy and an example of consolidation of a troubled regime, or both?
I think if we're talking about this draft that we're seeing, it is both. I mean, it's an accumulation of what was going on, and it's not a particular blame for this current government, because this current government is not just the president, and it's not just even the new cabinet that he has, but it's the whole bureaucracy. And I can confidently talk about this because I worked at the Ministry of International Cooperation. In fact, I worked with Minister Faiza Abunaga herself. I was working in her office, and I was evaluating those projects. And I saw, the mindset of the people who are working on civil society issues are not conditioned or not trained in the same way as the understanding of how civil society works. They are government civil servants. Their mindset is different. They don't understand how and why we do these things. So in order to shift a 30 years long standing bureaucracy, it's not a problem of just this. It would be unfair to say that this is a problem of the president or the people around him, but it's a continuation of that.
Yeah. I mean, clearly Egypt is in transition. Clearly people are coming to terms with new conditions and new challenges, and I think the debate around the law very much reflects that. We'll be continuing to watch the draft NGO law, and I'm sure we'll come back to debate the final law and how the NGO community can work with it or challenge it in the future. But in the meantime, we're out of time, and everyone's terribly hot and needs to get back to where they're from. So thank you all for coming, and thank our two amazing speakers today. Thank you. We're going to get you back to Egypt someday.
Thank you.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Yes.